everybody to this webinar today. It's based on a new report that we have put out on the carbon border adjustment mechanism. It's a big word, but it's essentially a tax imposed by the European Union to provide a level playing field to its industries, which have to make emission reductions in Europe. It's part of a slew of measures that have come from different countries, particularly the developed countries, to try and ramp up action on climate change. Europe has a CBAM, which is a tax. The US has an incentive-based, subsidy-based program called IRS. So it's these are all different steps that are being taken. Now, for CSC, and that's what we would like to present and discuss today, this is the first of our discussions on the trade issue. There are three major questions that we have as we move ahead. One is the whole the linkages between trade and climate change as they're emerging in our new world. Whether it is the tax on Chinese goods and what will it do to the energy transition, whether it is CBAM, whether it is the subsidy that the US is providing, how effective will it be? These are issues that concern us in the countries of the South, and that is why CSC is looking at them, not just as a Southern country interested in trade, but really interested in climate change. And I want to make that very clear to you. We are not trade specialists. We are a group of people which work on climate change. And we are looking to see whether these new trade measures will help us in our battle against climate change, in the existential battle against climate change or not. The other area that we are looking at is finance, and many of you joined us when we published our report on the voluntary carbon market. We are looking at, we've also done a report looking at the nature of finance that is available to the countries of the South, whether it is able to make the transition that we need or not. What do we need? And that's really an area that we will continue to work, and we will be putting out further reports this month itself. And the third most important and the underlying area for most of our work at CSC is really the issue of climate justice, of equity. And for us, the issue of equity is not something that gets added on, but it's an imperative. It's an essential if you want any action, meaningful action to be taken on climate change. And so for us at CSC, these are the issues that we want to keep discussing, perhaps in a way to be able to get a better dialogue going, because we also believe that that climate change is one of the most intractable issues because it requires cooperation, and cooperation requires a dialogue. And a dialogue only comes when both sides have a point of view. And that is really critical for us to put out these papers, have these discussions so that we can start the conversation. This is not the end of the conversation. This is not us versus you, but it is the beginning of a conversation. So let me then ask Avantika to put forward actually, I'm going to turn to Trishant. Trishant Dev is a colleague who works in the climate change team and has very much contributed to this, in fact, is the co-author of this report with Avantika on the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Trishant, please go ahead.
Thank you, Sunita ma'am. So to begin with the presentation, can we go straight to the first slide? Yeah, thank you, Avantika. So we have to start by understanding what a carbon border tax is before we understand the EU CBAM and why is it applied. A carbon border tax is a trade policy that imposes tax on imported goods based on the greenhouse gas emissions produced during their manufacturing. This ensures that these imported goods are subject to similar pricing mechanisms as domestic products, which are taxed for their own carbon emissions. And this could be through carbon markets, or this could be through carbon taxes. This is to prevent any sort of comparative disadvantage for local producers. Thus, this CBAM is the EU's version of a carbon border tax. It aims to ensure that the EU companies, which are required to pay for their CO2 emission under the EU's own emission trading system, compete on equal terms with non-EU companies importing products to the EU. So this tax would essentially apply a carbon price to products imported into the EU. Next slide. But what is the justification for introducing the CBAM? So the European Union has an emission trading system, as I just said, a type of carbon market where industries, heat generation units, aviation sector, and others buy emission permits, which are either auctioned by the EU or sold in the secondary market. At the end of each year, companies must surrender enough allowances to cover their emissions. If they reduce their emissions, they can keep the spare allowances with themselves to cover future needs, or they can sell it to the companies that might need it. So basically, this is how the EU ETS functions. However, under the EU ETS at present, the industrial sector receives emission permits largely for free. Almost 95% of the industrial emissions are not subject to any cost for the industries. The primary justification the EU gives for free allowances is the potential for carbon leakage. If industries are required to pay a carbon price, they may shift production to jurisdictions outside the EU that do not have a carbon price, or they may even lose their market to foreign goods. So the graph that you see on the right-hand side, the emission reduction of different sectors under the EU ETS has been depicted. And the yellow line indicates emission from industrial installations, green for aviation, blue is the total, and red is the electricity and heat production. If you see between 2012 and 2019, it is quite clear that there was hardly any reduction in industrial emissions. So the EU argues that to transition away from free allowances for the industries to really reduce their emissions, it is argued that a carbon border tax is necessary. Can we go to the next slide? So this carbon tax would be determined by a methodology that parallels the reporting mechanism under the EU ETS. The CBAM reporting period started in October 2023. Right now, only the emissions have to be reported and no tax has to be paid, but the tax would be payable starting January 2026. And with that, I start with the potential impacts of the CBAM. So it has been a subject of studies by various institutions, largely modeling exercises, and we see some interesting results coming out of these studies. So this is a World Bank calculated index on your screen. It's called an exposure index. It basically shows that countries that have a high export dependence on the EU and have the most carbon intensive production are hit the hardest by the CBAM. So if you see the most exposed countries, you'll see that the top spots are mostly occupied by the developing countries, and the developed countries mostly rests at the bottom as the least exposed countries to CBAM. Next slide. Another model study done by the Asian Development Bank says that the CBAM might reduce global emissions only by 0.2% with a €100 per ton carbon price, and by 0.37% with a €200 per ton carbon price. Nonetheless, they anticipate that it will significantly disrupt global trade, resulting in about 1.1% reduction in Asia's exports to the EU. Next slide. Now, CSE has done its own analysis of CBAM's impact on India. And this is a more granular analysis in the sense that we examined product-wise trade data made available by the Ministry of Commerce, Government of India, and the emission factors given for the interim period by the European Union. India's CBAM covered goods, we calculate the CBAM covered goods exports to the European Union comprised around 9.9% of the total goods export to the EU in the year 2022 and 2023. Can you go to the next slide? Further, we also calculate that sector-wise, considering that the goods are covered under the CBAM presently, these are the goods that are covered. 26 and 28% of our aluminium and iron and steel exports respectively were headed to the EU in the year 2022, 2023. And these sectors tend to dominate the basket of CBAM covered goods that are shipped from India to the European Union. Next slide. So an important conclusion we draw from our analysis is that the average burden of CBAM as a tax calculated over a three-year period was found to be 25% annually over and above the value of the CBAM covered goods. So this is the cost to be borne by the supply chain of these products. And this is specific to India, the calculation that we have done. This tax burden was about 0.05% of India's GDP in 2022-2023. A more detailed breakup of this analysis, of this calculation, is given in the report. And with that, next slide, I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Avantika Goswami, to walk you through the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Trishant. Thank you very much. Avantika, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Hope I'm audible to everyone.
Yes, clear.
Okay. So thank you, Sunita ma'am, and thank you, Trishant, for your great work on this report and for presenting some of our conclusions. So I'll quickly delve into our overarching perspectives on the CBAM, looking at its implications for developing countries. There are a number of emerging issues that come up when a tool like this is being launched. There's no precedence for a carbon border adjustment mechanism because there isn't a precedent for the EU ETS itself. So it is raising a number of new kinds of challenges and considerations, both from a climate as well as economic justice point of view. The first is this whole question of carbon leakage itself, and this is something that we've detailed out in the paper. There are empirical studies which have assessed whether or not carbon leakage is going to occur when a climate policy is introduced in a country or a carbon price is introduced, and the results vary widely. There isn't a direct causal link between the application of a carbon price and subsequent carbon leakage. And leakage here, as Trishant mentioned earlier, is domestic industries relocating to other jurisdictions that are not imposing a carbon price, or jurisdictions with more lenient laws. So relocating for an industry involves multiple costs and also has considerations of loss of market share, brand presence. So the decision that a firm makes may not be solely based on the application of a carbon price. Moreover, the application of a CBAM itself to curb this leakage is also not clear. So currently, the CBAM rollout is hinged on this premise that there will be carbon leakage from the EU, but studies are showing that this is inconclusive right now. So the premise itself is quite shaky. Our second and actually most important perspective and reflection on the CBAM is that it's essentially transferring the burden of decarbonization to the poor. And we say this because data has shown that high carbon production activities have been shifted to developing countries over the past 2+ decades, while lower carbon activities have been retained in developed countries. So this is data that UNCTAD has produced, and as well as other groups have also produced. If you see the graph on the left, the percentage share of global manufacturing today has shifted to South and East Asia, and the share of Europe and North America has actually declined. If you look at it from the perspective of emissions itself, where we compare production emissions, that's emissions within a country's territory to produce its goods, versus consumption emissions, emissions from the consumption of goods, either produced domestically or imported from abroad, we find that OECD countries have actually got higher consumption emissions over the past 3 decades than their production emissions. And this is essentially points to the offshoring of emissions to other jurisdictions by these wealthy countries. If we look at the EU in particular, most of its offshoring has actually occurred in the high emitting, heavy manufacturing sectors. And this reflects in the trade data as well. So for steel-based imports for the EU, import penetration increased from 16 to 23% between 2009 to 2022. Similarly, for aluminium, imports increased between 1995 and 2022. This means that the EU has been offshoring a significant share of its emissions. But what is also happening is that domestically, its territorial emissions have not reduced at pace. And the EU has continued to occupy carbon space. In fact, its per capita emissions today is far higher than the developing world. And this is an aspect that Sunita ma'am will share more light on, but this is one of our main concerns with the current model. In conclusion, on the aspect of shifting the burden, the CBAM is, in our view, in strong violation of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities enshrined in the Paris Agreement, because it is essentially posing a competitive disadvantage to firms in developing countries. And these are firms which do have more carbon-intensive production today as compared to richer countries. And this, when the Paris Agreement itself emphasizes that developed countries must extend financial and technological support to help our part of the world decarbonize. As we all know from the climate finance discourse, this hasn't happened. And the CBAM further violates this imbalance of power. Thirdly, the CBAM is likely to pose a significant administrative burden. The monitoring, reporting, verification process of emissions is complex and requires immense capacity, and developing countries may currently lack this, most likely. In terms of carbon pricing as a mechanism itself, we have a number of concerns in terms of the heavy emphasis that is placed on using carbon pricing as a core driver of decarbonization. So in the paper, we detail out how there is going to be a number of challenges related to equivalence of methodology and standardization. Today, a number of countries are coming up with their own ETSs, their own different models of carbon markets, and ensuring an equivalence of measuring how their carbon price equates with that of the ETS is going to be an immensely complex process, and the results will vary widely. Moreover, even if developing countries impose a domestic carbon pricing mechanism, it's unlikely that they will reach carbon prices as high as those that exist in the EU, which are anywhere between 60 to 100 euros per ton of carbon. If we impose 100 euros per ton of carbon on our domestic firms today, they will find it very hard to remain competitive, which means that even if we institute a domestic carbon pricing mechanism, we will likely still have to bear a CBAM burden as per the rules of CBAM that the EU Commission has rolled out. Lastly, on the issue of carbon pricing itself, and this is a very important point that we want to spotlight, is that a CBAM is premised on developing countries and all countries, in fact, having carbon pricing mechanisms in place. But it overlooks all the other types of non-pricing policies that countries have in place, which will actually lower their emissions intensity. India has a non-fossil-based power capacity target in its NDC. It has subsidies for electric vehicles. It's offering subsidy schemes for the manufacture of solar panels and a host of other policies which will, over time, actually reduce our GHG emissions intensity. But the CBAM methodology currently doesn't account for these in terms of calculating and thereby nullifying our tax burden for CBAM. Lastly, on the issues of concern is the question of what happens next. So today, CBAM is limited to the European Union and just 5 or 6 industrial sectors, but there are multiple other countries, mostly developed countries, who are unveiling their own versions of border adjustment mechanisms. And an implementation of CBAM by more countries, as well as its expansion to economy-wide trade, could exponentially increase the adverse impacts on exporting countries and potentially lead to a trade war, which currently is not the need of the hour. As Sunita ma'am mentioned, we need cooperation to address the climate crisis. So with that, I'll provide a quick overview of our broad policy recommendations for the CBAM These are currently at a very macro level, and more specific sector-wise policy recommendations can evolve over time. But our first and most important issue to raise to the European Union is to recycle revenues raised by the CBAM to countries who need it, countries like ours in the developing world, to decarbonize our manufacturing sectors. The current estimates suggest that CBAM should generate about 1.5 billion euros in revenue per year, which is currently expected to go into the EU budget as well as national budgets of European countries. This should be put into a decarbonization fund to help countries like ours decarbonize and shift to low carbon production processes, which require substantial financial resources and technical know-how. The EU does have a precedent for this. In fact, it has a modernization fund, which is currently set up, financed with the ETS's revenue, and this revenue is spent on clean energy in 13 lower income EU member states. So there's a strong justification to apply this to the rest of the world and trade partners as well, particularly developing countries. We also press on the fact that the EU must raise its climate finance contributions in order to counter some of the inequality and injustice that the CBAM is propagating at the moment, potentially. And we also advocate for the exemption of the least developed countries and small island states from the CBAM for as long as it takes for them to decarbonize their manufacturing sectors. We are by no means suggesting that developing countries must stay idle. They must be proactive and adapt to this changing trade and climate regime. And some of our recommendations for developing countries in the global south. Firstly, we believe that they must have sectoral climate mitigation plans in place. Since they should be demanding recycling of CBAM revenues, it's essential that this revenue is directed towards specific decarbonization plans, which are in line with our domestic imperatives. And this also assures the European Union that its support is being targeted and impactful. We strongly also believe that in the interim, while our manufacturing sectors are decarbonizing, we could adopt a dual approach in terms of exporting greener products to markets which prioritize environmental considerations, whilst exporting other products to markets which prioritize cost over environmental considerations. This is by no means a long-term solution, but what it could do is buy our industries time to decarbonize at an overall fairer pace. A very important proposal that others have made and that we strongly do support as CSE is that developing countries could impose a carbon tax domestically at the point of exports. A carbon tax would qualify as a carbon pricing mechanism as per the EU's CBAM rules. And this essentially enables us to retain this revenue domestically. And we believe that this should be diverted to a government-managed decarbonization fund, which can then enable the same industries to decarbonize and lower their overall GHG emission intensity. This also allows us to assert greater control over our mitigation pathways and achieve decarbonization where it is best possible. And lastly, this is a proposal that we also believe in, is that given the historical imbalances, both in terms of historical emissions as well as offshoring of carbon-intensive production, there is a possibility that countries can impose a historical polluter tax on their trade partners who are historical emitters and possibly are also imposing a carbon border tax. There is a strong justification for this to reverse the injustices that have been perpetuated. The global north has utilized fossil fuels in its early stages of development, which has enabled it to amass wealth and grow its economies. The imposition of a CBAM here inherently neglects this historical trend and penalizes countries like ours in the global south. So we believe that a measure like this is not necessarily a retaliation, but it's actually a course correction that the global south should be allowed to use to impose a cost on the global north for years of polluting and historical emissions. So with that, I conclude my presentation and I'll turn to Sunita ma'am for her closing statements.
Good. So just if you put this off, then I can do a quick it's a sort of a quick recap of what you have said, but from our perspective. So, okay. So firstly, let's be clear, as environmentalists, we very strongly look at trade having played a very big but a negative role in combating greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, what we don't often talk about is how in the 90s, when we were discussing the Framework Convention on Climate Change at Rio, and the world agreed to a convention which would reduce emissions in the countries which were historical emitters and simultaneously allow the right to development for other countries, but enabled with finance and technology so that that development would be different. That was the Framework Convention in 1992. But what we don't often talk about and connect is the fact that also in the 90s, the world agreed to economic rules. So the first one was ecological globalization. And in the 90s, with the coming of the World Trade Organization, you got economic rules, an economic globalization happening. Now, actually, the economic globalization worked contrary to ecological globalization, because the premise of economic globalization was that you would move production to countries where environmental and labor standards were lower. So the cost of emissions, the cost of production would be lower, the cost to the importing countries would therefore be lower. That was the premise of the economic globalization. And these actually contradicted each other. So if you look at just the data from China, in China joined WTO in 2001, its share of emissions, its share of emissions went from 5%, this is the global emissions, 5% to 28% in 2019. Now, so I wanted to start with this just to tell you that we at CSE do understand that trade has had a very adverse impact on climate change, measures to combat it. But the question that we are asking, and what Avantika and Trishant have asked on from CSE is CBAM the way to go when old industrialized countries now want to reverse this trend? If you look at the historical emissions, and you have to place CBAM within it, you cannot say CBAM is about current and forget the past. It isn't about the past. This is about the trajectory of emissions and where EU stands in it. If you look at this, you can see very clearly the 7 historical emitters, which we have put down as the emitters which are in yellow. And you will see here that as of 1870, these are the countries with the highest burden of emissions and emissions that they needed to reduce. Now, if you look at it from another perspective, this is the appropriation of the global carbon emissions. This is now taking the emissions in terms of the percentage of the total emissions between 1870 to 2019, and then also up to 2030. Now, even with the EU's share and projected share to reduce its emissions, you still have EU occupying 17% of the global carbon budget by 2019, and this only marginally goes down to 15%. The basic point here is that what has gone up is the role of China, which then occupies almost the same space as the United States by 2030. But the point with EU is, and that's where we are saying CBAM cannot be looked at differently from the perspective of the emissions, the historical emissions, and the burden sharing that we need in the world, so that we, which is part of this 70% at the bottom, which will occupy only 30% of the global emission budget by 2030, we need the right to develop. We need the space to develop, and we need the space to develop differently. Now, if you look at the European Union and its target, it's very ambitious, it's wonderful. It is definitely one of the front runner when it comes in the world to setting tough targets for emission reduction, no question about it. EU's target is 55% below 1990 levels. Every other country has slipped by just changing the benchmark year to 2001, basically looking at any year where after which it could take the emission reduction. So EU has been good about it. But if you look at its own data, it's only 32% currently below 1990 levels. Now, when you add to it the imported emissions, the emissions that Avantika was talking about, the phase of EU where they essentially did not reduce their emissions domestically, but they essentially imported the emissions. They exported manufacturing. Then we have calculated that to be 19% average annually between 1990 to 2001. So we cannot compare this to this because this is a cumulative number, this is an annual number, but we are working on that further. But the point I want to make very clearly is that the European Union is not on track for reducing its emissions when it comes to the fair share and the emission and the burden sharing that we need in the world. We also have to add to it two other factors, the offsets that have happened in this emission reduction journey of the European Union, and also the adjustments that we need to make for the collapse of economies of the former Soviet Union countries. So this average now is for EU 27. It's not for the original EU, which was there in 1990. And if you look at the disaggregated data, you will see that there are certain countries which have definitely reduced beyond their share, whether it is Denmark, Sweden, even Germany, though Germany also had the Eastern European share of reduced emissions, but there are certain countries which have actually increased their share, like Spain. So you cannot correct this by now shifting the burden of transition to emerging and the developing world. Now, there are two core issues here. One is trade, which needs corrections. And we are very clear that we need to talk about a different trade regime for a climate risk world. But it cannot be unilateral. It cannot add to the development and growth impact of countries in the South. We also have to understand that countries of the South today are wedded to the same global trade regime that was stitched up by the rich world, stitched up for their convenience. We are also wedded to an export-oriented manufacturing system in which our growth and prosperity comes from being able to sell and to be able to manufacture for the rest of the world. We also need finance for decarbonization. Now, this is really the other core issue, finance. We need to have money for industrial growth, for low carbon industrial growth. Remember, as I said, the world is running out of the budget to keep us below 1.5 degrees. We need 70% of the world still needs the right to grow. So how do we have investment for low carbon growth? Last year, we put out a very detailed paper on the cost of capital, the debt burden of countries, and we had argued that we need to make sure that finance is concessional and grant-based, and not that one that adds to the debt burden of countries. So what we are saying, and I'm compressing what Avantika said, in two proposals that we would like to really look to see happen. One, the CBAM tax should not cross borders. So what we are simply saying is that, yes, impose a tax, a carbon tax, but the money should be deposited in the country. It should create a decarbonization fund, which then can be used for transformative action in the exporting countries. Now, this will suit what the EU has asked for, which is a level playing field for its industry. It will also provide funds for countries of the South to invest in low carbon growth. So it is a win-win. The other tax that we are saying is a counter tax, a tax imposed on imported goods, which the countries of the South should should impose, because finance is critical for transition. We are already hit today because of the fact that the world is now crossing 1.1, 1.2. In fact, people are talking about already having crossed the 1.5 degrees centigrade, if you look at the cumulative emissions in the atmosphere already. And that has major impact on us. So we need the tax on imported goods, which will also provide, and I'm looking at it from another point of view, an incentives for localization, because we want to find a different trajectory of growth in the world. So it's a win-win. Finally, and this is the larger point that we are making, something that we will keep working on and keep arguing for, that we need new trade rules for a climate risk world. Currently, what we see is hypocrisy and double standards. When Indonesia wanted to promote localization by banning nickel, it was objected to, and Indonesia was taken to WTO. But when the US puts huge subsidy to it, gives huge subsidy to its industry under IRA, this is not contested. The European Union's deforestation regulation will put new burdens on commodity exports from Africa. These commodities are already being exported at discounted rates. They will put even less money in the hands of countries to make the energy transition. So we essentially are arguing that in an overshoot time today, the CBAM can only work if it provides the necessary enabling mechanisms for countries of the South to make the transition and the transformation for a low carbon growth. It does not do so today. It only shifts the burden of low carbon growth on us, and that's not acceptable. So that's really a quick summary of what we have to say. And as the moderator, it's a horrible place to be in as a chair and a moderator, but I will come straight to Claudia. Claudia is from UNCTAD and has actually been somebody we have, whose research we have used, and because she is the first, she put out the first paper on CBAM and its economic impacts. She is the Economic Affairs Officer at UNCTAD. Claudia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sunita. Thank you, colleagues from CSE for having me today. It's good to be here. Well, I will tell you a little bit about the work we did in 2021 and the findings that we're getting now when we're updating these reports. So first, let me give you like a quick description of the instrument of the CBAM, how we see it. Well, the European Union, they argue that the CBAM is an environmental policy. You know, it's already there a difference. With the objective to apply the same carbon cost to imported products that the cost that the European Union producers pay. You know, Trisha already explained that. It covers not all sectors, so only some sectors: cement, iron, steel, aluminium, and some chemical industries, fertilizers, or hydrogen. So it's important to have that clarity that is not overall through the economy. These sectors are already covered in the emission trading system of the European Union, and this is only a subsample. Okay, the emission trading system covers also additional sectors. It's important to consider this and take into account, because in the future, in the regulation of CBAM, it is mentioned there that in the future the CBAM could expand to the other sections of the emission trading system. So when we're thinking about today and in the future, we need to look at where the ETS is and where the CBAM is in terms of coverage. So the importers, so who pays the CBAM? This is the thing. One is the importers are the ones that will have, the importers in the European Union are the ones that will have to surrender the CBAM certificates, what is very well explained in the paper that you published today. CBAM certificates for the embedded emissions in the covered products, and the price of the certificates will be aligned with the price of the ETS. So what happened here? What is how it works? So exports from countries that have cleaner production processes will pay less, all right, because they have lower embodied carbon emissions, and they could also deduct any carbon price that is paid domestically. All right. So if a country already has a carbon price and is paying, they can say we're going to pay, when the importer surrenders the certificate, we say I'm bringing this aluminium from India, but already pay $3, and so I'm going to pay just for the difference. Okay. When you look at the exposure, not the impact yet, we're not even in the impact yet. When we're talking about the exposure, which are the countries that have more exports there that could be affected? At UNCTAD, we consider this, that you can do it in many different ways. So the World Bank has their own way to measure exposure. We consider it in terms of absolute level of exports. And you can see there is China, Turkey, Russian Federation, and United Kingdom, the countries that have the most that are most exposed to the mechanism. Each of them with more than 12 billion in exports to the European Union in the CBAM covered sectors in 2022. Okay. And then when you look at developing countries exposed in terms of total exports in CBAM products to the EU, you have they will have, in addition to China and Turkey, you have Vietnam, India, South Africa, Algeria, Brazil, Egypt, UAE, and Malaysia. Each country with more than 2 billion exports in 2022. LDCs, we find that only Mozambique will be the most exposed because of the aluminium exports to the European Union, and they export just under 2 billion in 2022. At the same time, it's important to take into account that the exports as a nominal value might not, tells you one side, but if you consider the level of exports in terms of the total exports of the country, then you have that the most exposed countries, when you measure like that, would be Mozambique. 21% of their exports are to European Union in CBAM sectors, then Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Ukraine. This is not the impact, it's just simple measure of exposure. So as Sunita, you mentioned, in 2021, we did a preliminary assessment of the potential of the CBAM. We focused on impact on international trade and emissions and income, and we used a model. So we were, to define the model, we used the features that were proposed in the early decision to legislate on the CBAM. So it was not exactly how it is the CBAM today, it was the idea. And we use a general equilibrium model from the Global Trade Analysis Project, with a very standard tool that the colleagues from Asian Development Bank have used it's the standard tool for this type of assessments. They provide a framework to simulate policy changes and trade the impacts. And also we, in this case, calculated a tariff equivalent to a CBAM. Say, depending on a price of a CBAM, we say this will be equivalent to having this tariff for each product in each country, based on the production process of each country. And what we found then, we found that the CBAM does what it's supposed to do. What they want to do is, European Union, to reduce the carbon leakage, okay, potential carbon leakage. So we found that introducing a CBAM reduces carbon leakage by 2/3, would reduce. Okay, then the issue is like, is it really a carbon leakage? It's very hard to find evidence in the literature of this carbon leakage because of the nature of the domestic policy that countries have used to avoid the carbon leakage. So kind of like a circular situation here. Because the European Union has these free allowances that Trishan was talking. So then, of course, there were free allowances. There was no any carbon leakage. You couldn't even test it. And now that the European Union, they want to say, we're not going to have more free allowances, so we need to protect themselves from this potential carbon leakage. So our modeling found that, it would do that. Okay, so it would reduce the carbon leakage. And however, and by then we'll level the field between imports and domestic production in the sectors covered. Important to know that the CBAM is not an isolated measure. It has to accompany a domestic carbon price. So you cannot just have a CBAM applied to exports and nothing else, or imports. First, supposedly in the modeling, we say, the European Union introduces a domestic carbon price of, in that year was $44. And then that means that they reduce the emissions, reduce production, there is leakage. So then apply a CBAM, and the CBAM reduces this leakage. That's how it works in theory. I'm going to go faster. Huh? So we are, what we found, when looking at the global emissions, the CBAM does very, very little. because also it's not this purpose. So it only in our estimates in 2001, we found that it reduces 0.1% of global emissions. So it's very, very little. It's not a tool to do that. Okay, the tool is to reduce leakage. After we did this study in 2021, many things changed. The CBAM was adopted was a little bit different in terms of sectors covered, type of emissions covered. When we did the estimates, we thought, as it was in the original documentation, that the LDCs would be exempted on seats. But at the end, in the adopted regulation, they were not. Okay, so now LDCs also will have to, the export from LDC also will have to pay CBAM. And at the same time, then the UK left the European Union, and they plan to do their own CBAM. So all these factors led us to, discuss and agree and revise these estimates. And we are doing that. We hope the result will be soon available. But what can I tell you today is that we are also finding that we're using higher value of the CBAM price, because before we did 44, now we're looking at almost double of that because of the trend in the EU ETS. We found that the CBAM would reduce leakage as with a previous study. Very small effect in global emissions again. And when you have a domestic carbon price plus a CBAM, there is a reduction of emission in the European Union and globally, but the contribution of the CBAM, if you look at just CBAM, is very small. So general trade effects, what happened with exports and competitiveness of countries. If a country, the European Union, only reduce their emissions through a carbon price, they say we're going to have a carbon price now, not more free allowances, that will imply an opportunity for countries with lower standards in more competitive. It will become a competitive advantage to be able to not have this domestic price. So that's why there is kind of an opportunity for countries to increase their exports. But then when you apply a CBAM, that increase in export reduces. So overall, we found that having after you introduce a CBAM, the trade moves, and goes increased trade for developed countries and reduced trade in developing countries. Okay, because the production tends to go where it's cleaner, and where is cleaner already in developed countries. So this highlights the importance of having access to the technology, having access to the finance, having access to the resources in order to have greener technologies. That is where the discussion goes. In terms of countries, Mozambique is one of affected. Bosnia, Egypt, we find they have the higher impact in terms of exports. So the CBAM then results in changes in international trade patterns and reduces exports from developing countries in favor of developing countries. This is very aligned with what we have seen. What do we see as implications here going forward? The issue is having a CBAM and having the European CBAM, the UK CBAM, and these different countries, developed countries, introducing this type of mechanisms to incorporate emissions in part of the price creates incentives for countries, incentives for companies to invest in renewable energy, to invest in greener technologies, and to create the policy measures to reduce whatever trade impact is possible there. So then the countries that have the resources will be benefited, and this will change into comparative advantage. What we think should happen is that all these type of tools now that are appearing all over, they should be developed and designed in alignment with the Paris Agreement, in alignment with the principles of the Paris Agreements on environmental international agreements. Okay, so they need to take into consideration other countries that have the capacities. Then also we have the issue of trade is an important source of revenue for some countries. So if it reduces then the trade impact, negative impact, these countries are going to have even fewer resources to fund their decarbonization. So what are we going to do there? So it's important that, that the countries implementing this type of measures support the other countries. So this highlights a huge importance of international cooperation. These measures cannot be just implemented without supportive policy measures. So what kind of specific support for countries? And I close here. Specific measures for countries. we're first supporting the reduce the compliance cost. At least the money collected for CBAM should go to support the compliance costs of countries that are kind of most affected. We think that could be an easy, straightforward way. Also, we agree with your proposal in kind of recycle the revenues from CBAM to support decarbonisation in the affected countries. Sectoral level, maybe if that could create an incentive to have the resources and not to say, we don't know where they're going to go. Although the CBAM does not consider exception from LDC, we think that at least they should have more time. You have a tool that already started. It's going to be reassessed in 2026. We hope that in 2026, there's going to be an assessment that could argue for this type of delay implementation, at least for LDCs on the most affected countries. So that would be. That is what I can tell you today, and I hope that is not is clear.
No, very clear. I think you're basically telling us that it is complex, but you're saying that it's difficult for us to design a scheme or it's important for us to design a scheme which does not have disproportionate impacts on countries. And I think that's the trade issue that you're getting to, which is very important. Let me now turn to Fatin. Fatin has also co-authored a very important report that we read and that we found very useful. Fatin is from the African Climate Foundation report. She co-authored the report by the African Climate Foundation, and she is the executive director of the African Future Policies Hub, a very important think tank bringing together different points of view from Africa. Fatin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sunita. Thanks to the team also for the invitation. For some time, I've been myself pushing for a more global South perspective and kind of different studies to see where we all stand. And I'm very happy to read the report of the team. I think there's a lot to be said, and a lot has been said already by the previous speakers on the CBAM, but I just wanted to pick up on a few issues more to add to the conversation. I think the first point that I wanted to highlight is whether the CBAM is in fact truly a climate measure. I think considering the fact that the global emission reduction impact of the CBAM is 0.1%, but also I think if one looks at the LDCs, for example, the emission even more significant, it's 0.0001%. And yet they will also be impacted. So this carpet almost application of the CBAM in itself, I think, raises the question on whether with its climate impact is truly what it's about. But what we already know very clearly from the modeling done, fantastic modeling by UNCTAD, the one that we have done, the one that you've done, is that what's clear is that the economic impact is significant. And I'm highlighting the economic impact as well because it has ramifications in terms of the responsive capacity of the countries themselves, to also take over the response themselves, its livelihoods of people, etc. And then we have done, what we found is that the economic impact on Africa would result in a $25 billion loss per EP. To put it in perspective, as an entire continent, we receive just under 30 billion per annum in climate finance, and that's way under what is required for a solid response to the climate challenge on the continent. So we're essentially losing 25 billion, and that's not necessarily being compensated. So it's a significant concern. There's of course, I think we've spoken about it, the justice and the burden shifting component of it. As a continent, the historical contribution is significant. We're even up to now under 4% contributor to GHG emissions. And so this is truly experienced as an attempt by the EU to shift the burden to other countries in terms of decarbonisation, and that without necessarily providing the necessary tools financially or in terms of more larger scale technical support in terms of accounting systems. Many of our countries, in fact, I would dare say all of them except for one, do not have a emission counting system that would be acceptable for a CBAM type of system. So we still need to truly build those systems. It's costly. And speaking to different exporters, they're already experiencing challenges now because they are already obliged to report now until the CBAM fully enters into force in 2027, and there are already significant challenges. And so we first need to build that system. Let alone, the system around how are we producing. The whole green production economy, I think, is yet to come. And we will absolutely not be ready by 2027. The risk of early deindustrialization in Africa is significant. That would have longer impact in terms of our structural transformation as a continent. And so the unilateral action is really experienced as an attempt to, not an attempt, but as a well-intended measure, but with significantly negative impacts on international partners. And there's obviously the question on legality. It's still to be discussed. It's been discussed within the level of the WTO whether this unilateral measure meets the trade rules that have been agreed on, which I would agree need changing. But the EU, after all, was one of those who strongly pushed for it until now. But I wanted to focus on further on a few issues in terms of the way forward. We spoke about financing, and one of the promises and the point was picked up is that the EU would recycle some of the revenue. The EU was forecasting a revenue of 1.5 billion out of the CBAM. As I said, for the African continent alone, we're forecasting 25 billion loss per year. There is no way that revenue collected will compensate for the losses. And so what we are rather advocating for is a more structural, structurally aware response that would make sure that there is a certain sequencing in the manner in which the CBAM is applied to avoid this shock essentially on the economies as we have them. So there is an issue of quantum here in terms of the capacity of finance, but we also have an issue around the legality even of the recycling. I think, as has been explained earlier very well, the CBAM is tied to the ETS, and there's an ETS legislation that is extremely clear on what the revenue should be used for, and that is for the EU Innovation Fund, and for subsidies essentially for the EU affected sectors to transition. And so even if the European Commission had wanted to recycle, or let's say one directorate of the European Commission had wanted to recycle, they would need to go into this legal struggle with possibly even other parts of the Commission and with different bodies of the Commission. So it's not a given that the legality of the recycling would be addressed. There, the other point is relates to the compatibility and equivalency of systems. I think it was raised earlier that if countries introduce carbon prices, which some, I know in Africa, some of the countries are toying around with that, they can keep the revenue. That is the case if the EU accepts that system and recognizes it as equivalent to what they're applying to the ETS. And so in itself, that is not automatic. It would be subject to negotiations. And again, that is energy taken out of the countries essentially. And I mean, I speak for the case of Africa. It's hard to negotiate with the EU on trade matters, and we're diverting now even more attention on this. So this issue of equivalency is not a given. And I think, as was raised earlier, we will have a situation where countries will need to negotiate it with the EU. I mean, the UK, if they introduce it, they will align it to the EU, so that may be an easier one. But if we have more countries going down the route of their own carbon border adjustment mechanisms with some variables, we may need to negotiate individually again, which is not necessarily a good practice in terms of international negotiations. The last point that I wanted to highlight, maybe two more points, is that we had an important reminder, I felt, at the last COP, that trade measures, we should avoid trade measures that are unilateral and they may undermine climate action. And my fear is that the CBAM, unfortunately, we're already in a situation of high tension in the climate negotiations, and we're adding to it through measures like these. And it's not necessarily a conducive environment for positive collective action on an issue such as climate change. So the COP28 reintroduced exactly the same language as we had in the pact in '92, but I think we need to argue for the next COP and potentially COP30 to push for this argument even more. What we have also argued on the African side is that we need to push for a delayed implementation for countries that are historically low emitters. I think Claudia also just raised that point. And we feel that would cater for the issue of justice. It would cater for an issue of a functioning trade system, but also would allow the countries themselves to plan even further the transition. We need to link it also to finance, and so I think that's probably, I think it's an opportunity we need to take in 2025. The Director General of the European Commission just last week or the week before, in a public statement, kind of opened the door for a possibility of these issues being taken on board. I think the challenge will be whether such assessments conducted by the European Commission happen in time for them to be integrated in the updated legislation. We do hope that the EU is diligent about that particular sequencing, that the assessments truly inform the next legislation, or the update and the entry into force, full force of the legislation. But in either case, I think we would really like to see an extension of the transition period, conditioned on availability and provision of climate finance promises. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Fatin. I think fascinating. I think very interesting and very important, as you said. We must have these voices and your analysis out there so that we can all have this conversation as we move ahead. Now, I have some very interesting questions, and I'm going to ask and open up the discussion. But I have one that has been really bothering me, and it's something that Avantika raised in our paper that we have highlighted. And I want to take the opportunity to ask Claudia, and particularly this issue. So, Claudia, premise of a lot of what we are talking about is that that price on carbon actually is the way to go ahead, and that is what will make the difference in terms of emission reduction. Now, India, as you know, also has the beginning of a carbon market that we are now devising the rules for. We have also looked at the voluntary carbon market, and that, of course, less said about it, the better. But the premise that the price on carbon will be the determinant for improved and for emission reduction. Now, I have two questions on that. One, is that really the case? And two, does it not make EU as the global, I don't know, policeman in the world telling us all what is the way to go ahead? I mean, surely we should decide what is a better way. I mean, what the EU is simply saying is if you have a carbon price, then you're okay if you put a price on your carbon. I mean, is that the way that global discussions are going to happen now? And in particular, the question about is there enough data that the price on carbon will? I asked Avantika and my other colleagues to look at this, and we are not very certain about it. But Claudia, please. And Fateh and I will come to you as well on this issue.
Well, I think you're talking about, I mean, I like your question because that's the same discussions we're having here. So I might come with further questions, you know.
Good.
We're just gonna have many questions in this session. Okay, two things. One, carbon pricing is not necessarily the only way. There are many other types of policies, okay? But don't forget that carbon pricing responds to this polluter pays principle, in which the companies that are polluting should kind of also have a cost. That is independent of whether the company is or whether the country is, historically low emitter. That is how the companies that are polluting should pay a cost. And then other countries are doing a set of different things. The US, they don't have a carbon pricing. They're doing all these subsidies, green subsidies, and other countries too. The countries that can have resources to implement this type of big policies, but not all of them, that is, especially in a context in which many countries are highly in debt. Then what you mentioned about the European Union saying that they decide carbon pricing or not, I mean, I don't have any relationship with them, I'm from Chile. No. But what I understand from the discussions here and what I've studied about the topic is that if the countries have other policies that also contribute to reduce the emissions in the production of steel, aluminium, the CBAM covered sectors, then we'll have a lower number of emission per ton of production, so they will pay less than a country that less per ton of production. So other policies should be reflected in the level of emission. The issue is the time. Other policies might take time to see effects, because you can have a carbon pricing might be easier to implement. You put a measure in, something to measure in the industrial emissions, and they start charging. Of course, there are other capacity challenges and stuff, but changing the technology of companies is a long-term decision. So a company might already renew the furnace for aluminium or for iron, and then it's stuck for 10 more years. So that is another thing. The principle of CBDR also recognizes there are different capacities, different resources. So that of course means that carbon price is not one. Is one of many other options, and then these policies need to be implemented, taking into account environmental goals and the economic consideration of countries and the impact on labor, and it's a full set of factors, and not only one. That's it.
But then, any points on this question that I asked on the tool, the measure?
No, I think there are multiple measures, and I think the challenge here is that we're seeing the EU essentially attempting to force a global standard, which again, I mean, it's a method that the EU has used before in multiple areas, but it's essentially forcing on others what the standard for decarbonization should be. And it's highly problematic because each country would have its capacity to address an issue based on certain matters. I think the challenge as well is the fact that we're not speaking of a flat carbon price. We're speaking of a fluctuating market-based kind of system that the EU has. Today you pay 80 euros, tomorrow you may be lucky and pay 50. So we're not speaking of a flat rate, which means that other countries will constantly need to respond to that. We do have other countries. I mean, if I take the case in Africa, we do have South Africa that does have a carbon price, but that's at around $6 per ton. The reason is its economic competitiveness and whether it is able to attract the industries and keep the industries if it goes to a higher rate. Of course, there's now, because of the situation of the CBAM, the question that some of the countries, I speak for the African case, we have around 3 countries at the moment that are exploring the option of introducing a carbon price for CBAM sectors pegged to the ETS. The logic there is that the certificates would be bought from the EU. We would see a revenue leakage in this sense from Africa into the EU. And so by introducing such a carbon price back to the ETS, we would be keeping that revenue here instead of it being leaked to the EU. But that is more of a response rather than, it's reactive rather than based on an assessment of the countries of what is best for them considering their situation. Again, as I said, we're in a context of very volatile kind of climate negotiations and these kind of measures. I think we need to look a bit higher in terms of trust building in the global system for us to be able to truly advance the agenda. And something like this, when you have a strong partner kind of forcing the arms of the others, instead of having a suite of measures that we choose for, is problematic.
Thank you, Fatin. Avantika, I won't ask you to respond right now. I'm going to come back to all of you. But the question that I wanted to take on was one of the first we got from Devang Pandya, which was a fascinating question on the Tata Steel issue, which we've been reading about, Avantika, and CSE has also done its own report on how steel industry could move towards low carbon growth in India. And in this case, what he is essentially saying is that how the electric arc furnace is now challenging the green transition in EU itself. And we have been reading about this largely because of labor issues. And in fact, he says that if all costs get included, it might make the project economically unviable or make the prices too high for customers. So, Claudia, this kind of feeds to the question that you asked about leakages, because there may be other reason for the leakage. And it's not, I mean, the electric arc furnace, the big debate in the European Union has really been the issue not just of cost, but really about labor and what this will do to worker rights and how many less workers do you need when you move from a blast furnace to an electric arc furnace. And whether that is something that countries will be able to afford. Now, does this entire, and I also saw that there were other questions on the steel industry in India and how it will respond. The pharma industry, somebody had said, is not part, and we agree it's not part of the initial list. May get added, as we're saying, this is only the beginning, we don't know. But on the steel sector, anything further that we want to add to what's the dilemma in Europe? And then, of course, what would it take in the Indian context as one of the large steel exporters to the European Union to deal with this, and whether this will help our decarbonization efforts? Avantika, you want to take this first?
Regarding the steel decarbonization questions, I think what we have essentially seen is that there are companies who are operating in multiple jurisdictions. So companies like Tata Steel, for example, who operate in India as well and are actually ahead of the curve in many ways in terms of having lower emissions intensity of production already. They also operate in jurisdictions like the UK, where they are set to receive subsidies for decarbonisation. And I think in the case of large transnational conglomerates, I think we had a brief discussion about this maybe with Claudia earlier yesterday, in that they will have a more complex response to something like a CBAM, as opposed to smaller companies who are specifically operating in one developing country and will certainly be exposed to a tax burden. I think there's going to be a differentiated response between larger transnational companies versus smaller exporters. In this sense, one could also look at the CBAM as an instrument that may eventually lead to more of market consolidation. So if you have larger companies who are able to actually adapt faster or have interests in other jurisdictions, you could see them retaining competitiveness over time and smaller companies starting to actually lose competitiveness. It's a hypothetical situation, but it's not impossible to consider. So yeah, that's kind of the perspective that we've had so far. But of course, it will be interesting to hear more from the industry in terms of what they're thinking. But happy to defer to other experts as well.
Claudia, you want to add to this?
Not particularly. Well, aluminium and steel are the most important products for India now in relation to CBAM. We know that. I mean, we have been talking about further research on this topic on CBAM, and we think it's important to look at which companies are we talking here, because for example, when you compare with the EU deforestation regulation, there you're talking about the smallholder farmers, not only in Africa, in Asia too, in Latin America too, in a set of value chains. That is a very big different impact that you might have in the CBAM sectors, which we're talking. Many companies are multinational that, as Avantika mentioned, work in India and also work in the UK, and they're actually decarbonizing in the UK. So maybe they could coordinate and collaborate with the different governments, with the host government, and where they have the headquarters, to move these technologies to developing countries where they might have other comparative advantages and benefit that actually can be productive and positive for developing countries. Don't forget that in developing countries, we have a lot of more opportunity for renewables. And if we can connect the grid and this do like an energy transition of the factories and connect the factories to the grid, and these are renewable, that will reduce the emissions of the production too. And that could become something positive. Of course, this requires big investments. We were looking at Mozambique, the case, and they have a lot of renewable, but not going to the aluminium plant. So it's like, oops, so we need to work in connecting that to create these opportunities for the countries.
Pate?
No, I think nothing to add. I think perhaps except this on this last point of Claudia, I think the opportunity is there. The challenge is in translating the opportunity to reality. And I think it's there where the concern around the CBAM is how do we move from that opportunity and translate it into reality? Yeah.
Now, I think, Fatin, from my point of view also, this is really at the core of our concern. I mean, European Union wants to improve its environmental compliance, wants to reduce emissions. That is good. And we also accept the fact that for too long, trade system has worked against climate change by exporting emissions out of countries. We understand all that. But our concern really is that does this help or hurt the developing and the emerging countries which need finances to be able to make the transition possible? Now, in our view, and if indeed you're not getting the reductions in global emissions or European emissions at the scale, then the big question that we need to ask is this the measure that will help us or hurt us? And Bettina has asked a very important question, which is, if we would accept CBAM if the money was kept in the country. frankly, Bettina, we would like a fundamental rethink of CBAM, but we don't think that EU right now, and given the fact that it's already going ahead, so then we are looking at, okay, so what can we make out of a bad situation? And out of a bad situation, what we could think of is, can we create a condition in which at least the money, the tax that is being imposed, and that will, of course, depend on the tax. As you very clearly said, Faten, it's not a flat rate. It's going to depend on the different taxation rates in the European Union. But from Trishant and Avantika's assessment in India, it is substantial money. So the question that we are asking is, why should that tax go to the European Union? If that money is retained in the country, the taxation money, one advantage of that could be for us to use that funding for abatement measures, for reducing the carbon intensity, which indeed is the European Union's real objective. They want to reduce carbon intensity across the world. And they are essentially saying, our industry is doing so, why isn't your industry doing it? And we are simply saying that if you look at it from a fair burden point of view, then you are first shifting the burden. But even if we accept that, we're saying, if we have the funds, which was also part of the first Framework Convention on Climate Change, the money to be able to invest in decarbonization. Now, there's a lot of questions on that, and I don't want to open this whole area into the issue of finance, because that is clearly an issue on which we have already spoken about earlier as well. And we will continue, and we will do further webinars. And we know that the amount of finance coming for decarbonization in the emerging world is too little. And Faten, your data is so important to be able to explain that the cost on Africa is going to be roughly equivalent to the money that the entire Africa is getting for climate finance. Now, if I was to further ask you, that climate finance is not coming as grant, it's probably coming as equity. Now, that only increases the debt burden of Africa as well, which has already got a very high price of capital. So these are some fundamental flaws which are stopping our part of the world from making the kind of investment we need to make in the transition. So we are simply arguing that out of this bad situation, perhaps the only thing that we can think of is at least the fund. And I accept the fact that you said that recycling may not be possible, but maybe countries of the South need to step in now and agree as a unilateral measure that any CBAM fund will not be transferred to the European Union. That's an agreement that the countries of the South have to come up with, that fine, you're imposing a tax on us, which is not fair, but we accept the fact that you're powerful, that you have more trade advantage on us, but that money should not then be paid out of the country, but be used for what is clearly the purpose for the rest of the world, which is to reduce emissions. Claudia, Dr. Herbert Danso has been raising the issue of financing quite often, and in many of his comments. Do you want at all to reply to the point that he's making on the whole issue of the volume of money that is needed for climate financing?
I mean, I can make a comment on the level of investment. You know, my colleagues here in ANTA the last year, they did an assessment of the money that's going to renewable energy projects. And they found that it was big, I know it was a lot of money, but it's not going to the places where it's needed. And that is the issue: how to reduce the risk, how to ensure, how to create the conditions for the investors to put the money in renewable energy projects where they're needed the most, and not in the same few developing countries and mostly developed regions. So that is something that is important to do.
Okay. Avantika, is there any question that you feel I've missed? I mean, there are a lot of technical issues. Aparna has asked a very important issue. I mean, a lot of the answers will also be in our report, but yes, Avantika, sorry, you had your hand up. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to address this question of offsetting, which has been very interesting to us because of Trishant's report last year on the voluntary carbon market in India. And this perspective that we've raised in this report, and there have been a couple of questions on offsetting that we've replied to as well. But essentially, just for the viewers, our point of view is that in the early stages of the EU ETS, the purchase of international carbon credits from the CBAM and joint implementation were permitted. And data has shown from various sources that the price of credits, firstly, most of the projects for these credits have been located in developing countries. Price of credits has been extremely low. And we've addressed this in our report last year as well, titled Discredited. But the ETS phased out the use of offsets under its jurisdiction in later stages, no doubt. But the fact still is that for a certain number of years, companies operating under the ETS were allowed to buy cheap offsets from the developing world. So this is this inherent dissonance that we are raising in this report, that the fact that EU companies can buy offsets priced at €1 per ton in many cases, and now the same countries are being asked to pay a carbon price of close to €100 per ton. There's an inherent injustice in that. And that's something we've not heard talked about a lot. And we've highlighted that in this report. And it's something important to us.
So Avantika, I love working with Avantika because she keeps me in control. But I basically have been arguing that we should demand that the same price should be the floor price for any offset. Whatever is the price of the tax, which is imposed under ETS, should also be the price for offset. Now, I know that may not be practical, but on the other hand, Fatin, given the fact that Africa is now looked at as the major continent from where offsets will be generated, the fact is Africa must benefit from it. India must benefit from it. Today, the cook stove initiative is being told that the only way we can bring in clean cook stoves into Africa is if we do it through a carbon offset. And what does that price actually mean? The women get nothing. The stoves get nothing. The money all goes into the hands of all your auditors, verifiers, and the entire company. So if Africa is an India, large parts of India where forests can be grown, largely because we are in an overshoot time, we will need to absorb more and more carbon. We need to clean carbon, which means trees are going to be critical. Now, if that is the case, then should the price of that offset not be determined at the same yardstick that you will determine for the tax on products being imported? So that's really one of the proposals that we would like to work on and put out as we move ahead, essentially demanding not just integrity from the carbon markets, but really the bottom line being the price, because integrity without learning to pay the price for it does not work in my world. So I can see we've reached the time limit. Trishant and Avantika, I'm sure you've been replying to a lot of the questions as well. Thank you so much. Is there anything that you feel is a burning question that I have not addressed that we want to address? Otherwise, I'm going to ask Claudia, Fatin, and the two of you for any last words and then wrap up. So Fatin, I will start with you.
Yeah, let me start with actually one of the comments and use that for my closing remarks. I see in the chat that Vladimir raised, which I believe is a key question, which is the reason precisely why we are so concerned with the impact of the CBAM, which is that the supplier can, let's say, your supplier to you that you cannot comply. Life is rough. I think I was cutting.
Fatin, would you switch off your video and just keep your audio on? Maybe your connection. Would you switch off your video and just keep your audio on? Can you hear us?
Hello?
Maybe Trishant, you can communicate with Fatin. In the meantime, I'll go to Claudia. So we're talking about Vladimir's question really on the whole issue of compliance and the data that it requires. Fatin is back. Fatin, yes. Please go ahead. You were discussing the big issue of data and compliance. Please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. So just that is one of the tips of the iceberg in terms of what we are to comply. You essentially use the EU market, and I think in the longer term accumulated, that is true. I mean, at the end of the day, as I said at the beginning, we're talking about jobs of people. We're talking about revenue for countries, and unless that is addressed very quickly, what the EU is doing is problematic. So we hope that within the spirit of real action around climate, that there is space, hopefully, as the assessment starts next year to be concluded in 2026 by the European Commission, that there is real attention for the impact of the entry into force of the CBAM on developing countries, and the not the short-term impact, but the overall impact truly for our countries in the long term will.
No, very important point. And thank you, Vladimir, for raising it. I think the whole issue of compliance and the cost of compliance is critical. I mean, actually, in another way, Fatin, EU is finding this becoming a major issue when it comes to its farmers. And one of the big protest against the organic farming regulations of the European Union is the cost of compliance for farmers. So I think the European Union should understand now more clearly that, these are issues that are really tough issues. And, they say their farmers have a point of view. Well, then we also have a point of view. And I think that's really where the conversation needs to be as well. Claudia, please. Last comments.
I think we need to increase cooperation. We need to really highlight the importance of international cooperation, the importance of dialogue and increased trust. For example, in the issue of standards, we don't want to have different type of standards, each country doing a CBAM or the country imposing any type of criteria for CO2 emissions, create their own system. So we need to collaborate to ensure that the systems are compatible. Not have to be the same, but they have to be compatible, and of course minimizing the cost for developing countries, especially of the small stakeholders, SMEs. Also, let's not forget. I want to close. Not forget that developing countries in this energy transition, they have a lot of assets, so they have a negotiation hand too, and we need to bring all our assets to the table and dialogue and bring solutions that are win-win agreements, not win-win agreements in which everyone can benefit.
Prashant?
Thank you, ma'am. I guess most of the questions we tried to answer in the chat box. There was this question on offsets, and Avantika answered it. There were questions around WTO, and we have made the point that yes, multilateral platforms are important. So many African countries have raised this issue at WTO, but the problem also is with the design of the international rules in WTO. CBAM is an unprecedented measure for them. So it's something that has to be dealt with in that way. Also, if you look at the UNFCCC, there is actually a provision of what is called as the implementation of impact of implementation of response measures that tries to address CBAM. But so far, the provision has been poorly utilized. I'm sure going forward, countries would think about it.
Avantika?
I just have one comment in terms of it's a concluding comment on this discussion of the need for cooperation, minimizing tensions and negotiations. We are definitely in favor of that. And I mean, CSC has been talking about the need for international cooperation. Sunita Narayan and Anil Agarwal have been talking about it for decades, and the need for a multilaterally agreed rules-based system to determine who cuts emissions, who provides finance, and so on. But the fact is that a lot of these measures today, like CBAM, are against all of that entire spirit. They are unilateral measures. They are essentially hostile in a sense. And they also completely ignore these questions of justice. And as somebody told me in a consultation I went to in May in the UK, that you have these developed countries who don't really think about the spillover effects of their policies. They're not sitting and thinking about how is the IRA affecting countries in other jurisdictions? How is the CBAM affecting? They're not thinking about that. And I really feel that it's time for the Global South to have a much stronger voice, and which is where some of our proposals are also coming from. We are definitely in favor of mutually collaborative, cooperative solutions. But in the absence of that spirit from developed countries, I don't see why Global South countries must kind of sit back and talk about meek, gentle approaches. So if a little bit of a stronger force is required in the approaches to be taken, I think it's okay. So that's where some of our proposals are coming from. And definitely the Global South should table more such proposals as a counter, to have an alternative on the table instead of just being defensive, being reactive. So that's just something I wanted to say.
Thank you, Avantika. Very well put. I think very well put that, cooperation requires us to both hands to clap together, and putting out a unilateral trade measure is not the best form of cooperation, especially when it comes to an issue like climate change. And another thing that, the whole trade issue is today going through these huge changes. In fact, Claudia, you talked about leakages. And for me, one of the big questions is that does IRA create conditions for leakage from EU to the US? Okay, and those are the conditions. I mean, I'm not sure if the leakage is going to be our side is going to be to the US, and whether the EU is really going to use CBAM's measures going to be effective in countering the IRA of the US. So I think those issues, plus the big issue, the big question that I think one of the next papers that I'm hoping that the climate team, Avantika, Trishant, and colleagues will put out is really, can we have many wars going on? And the war, the war against China with the war against nature, which will win, which will lose, is an issue that needs to be discussed as well. And so thank you again for joining us, and thank you for such amazing questions, comments, issues, a really well-informed discussion, and it gives us a lot of space for listening to your points of view. We will keep this discussion going, but I want to thank very much Fatin and Claudia for joining us. And I hope you won't mind if we call upon you again and again and again. So thank you very much for joining us. And thank you, Avantika and Trishant, for this amazing piece of work. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.